Hi, thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about the environmental changes that areas go through and the human effects on areas as well. If you haven't already, go ahead and look in the guided practice section and you can print out a guided practice and kind of fill this in with me as we go, and it might be helpful to you later. So the main thing that we should already know from previous years of science class is that organisms have to adapt to their environments. If they don't adapt, they either have to move or they're probably going to die. So certain ones happen pretty regularly. That's why certain animals migrate south for the winter to a warmer climate where it gets cold where they are. Or maybe their fur turns white when it snows, or perhaps they store water in their leaves like a cactus. These are seasonal and they occur on a regular cycle like tides and daily temperature changes. Whatever is born in that area is used to those effects. They know how to deal with that. However, sometimes something happens. So let's say that we had two communities and something happened, like a natural disaster. If you look at these two communities, one's got a variety of animals and one is more limited. Which one do you think would have a better chance of surviving a natural disaster? And the answer is Community A. They have more diversity. So on your paper, go ahead and circle Community A, and then just somewhere near that picture, if you would write in more diversity. Because when we're talking about an ecosystem surviving, we're not talking about an individual animal. That owl right there might die. But when we talk about the whole ecosystem surviving, we want something that can survive a whole species being killed off. If you look at the picture on the right, there are no owls. So if we have a disease, let's just say, that comes through an area, the whole ecosystem itself could still continue if there are still predators and plants and herbivores and carnivores, even if all the owls are gone. Like if some disease struck all the owls, which I hope not, that'd be very sad, but the ecosystem itself could continue. Whereas the one over here on the right, if you lose the mice, then there's nothing much for the bears to eat. They can live off flowers, but not much else. We don't have anything else for them to eat. But the picture on the left, if for some reason there isn't mice, they have other things that they can eat too. So that would help this ecosystem continue. So that's what we're going to be thinking about when we think of these changes that happen to an ecosystem. We want the ones that leave the most kinds of species in one area. And that includes plants, insects, carnivores, herbivores, omnivores. We want as much biodiversity in an area for it to be considered successful. Okay, so here we have a picture of a moth, and I think this one's on your picture too. There's actually two moths on here. There is a white peppered moth and a black peppered moth, and the tree that it's on is a white birch. So this moth had this genetic mutation, and it had found that when it landed on white birch trees, it had a much higher success rate of avoiding predators if they didn't have the dark black pepper wings. And so a long time ago, we had way more white peppered moths than black because they were camouflaged. Okay, so the black pepper moths actually started dying off. It was just a mutation that had happened, and it was really unfortunate. Just like there's certain animals that are albino, and so they're completely devoid of pigment. So like perfectly white alligators and perfectly shock white deer. This is a big disadvantage because then they can't sneak up on their food, or in the deer's case, they can't hide from predators. This particular time, the white turned out to be helpful. However, something happened. Human effects. So before, this was our picture from before. Now, around the Industrial Revolution, they started having a bunch of refineries, and man, we were making cars and steam engines and trains, and oh, we were pumping out the industry. We were also pumping a lot of coal soot out into the environment, and it actually turned the trees black right around the refineries. And so this is the same kind of tree, but look at which one is camouflaged now. The black peppered moth became the more successful species after the Industrial Revolution. And then the white moths were the ones that were easy to see and easier for predators like owls to eat. And after this, it took 4 generations of reproduction for the peppered moths, the black peppered moths, to create a successful adaptation to the new environment, where they were, the white ones weren't surviving long enough to pass their traits down to their children. They were getting killed off before they had baby moths. Whereas the black peppered moths, they were living long enough to pass those traits on. So the next thing you know, we got a lot more black peppered moths than we do white. Now, funny enough, this isn't in your notes, but now we've had such a push to clean our environment, we're actually changing it again on them, and the white ones are becoming more successful now. They just can't win, can they? Okay, so let's talk about some more of those unexpected changes. So we have 2 different kinds of changes. They're organized into short-term changes and long-term changes. So let's look at the short-term ones. What those really mean is that there's no time for the organisms to adapt. They don't really see it coming. They don't have a chance to, find healthy mutations and pass those down to their children. They're either going to have to leave if they're able, or they're going to die. And of course, there are certain organisms that aren't able to leave. So that stinks. So short-term changes that we're usually talking about are like floods, fires, oil spills, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, things that kind of come along pretty quickly. I know drought is usually a little slower, but not as slow as what we would consider the other long-term changes. So let's look over there. The long-term changes are going to occur over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands. And this gives time for the organisms to pass those successful traits down to their children. And then the ones that give it some kind of advantage, they'll live longer. And the ones that have a disadvantage, of course, they'll die off sooner. So these are things like climate change, which is happening a little too fast for us right now, and glacial melting. That's when it's changing faster anyway. So just a little note, both of these things were going to happen anyway, but because of pollution and because of global warming, they're happening a little too fast, or sometimes scientists say way too fast, for organisms to keep up with it and ecosystems to keep up with it. Okay, so make sure you fill in your blanks there. Now, how do humans affect ecosystems? That was more like nature-caused stuff. Turns out we have strong effects on the environment too. So on your page, you're going to fill in the blanks that you have. First one is agriculture. And if you didn't already know, that's hunting and fishing. And in the past, they would do this until the organism was extinct, like the dodo bird or a certain kind of tiger, and almost buffalo. Urbanization is another one, and that just means the building of cities. We love cities. That's where all the shops are. But before it was there, it was a forest or a river or a creek. And so the animals that lived there had to be moved out. We use up resources for ourselves, like fresh water. We cut down trees. We add pavement. This kind of changes the ecosystem. And whatever was needing those things is going to have to go find it somewhere else. Water pollution is a big one, as well as air pollution, but I didn't put that on here. Water pollution, we use our oceans quite a lot to transport goods from one country or continent to another. We also have some serious spill off from sewers back into the water. And one that just turned up in the last 60, 70 years, I know that sounds like a long time, but for the planet it's not, is that we're having a lot of runoff from farming. That runoff can be pesticides, of course, which can hurt fish, Or it can be fertilizers, which the fertilizers, of course, were meant to help the plants grow on land. But as it rains and that water seeps through the soil, it can get to the ocean. And I know that sounds like, okay, great, it'll help the ocean plants, right? But the problem is everything's got to stay in balance or homeostasis. And so if you have a ton of water plants like algae that grows on the surface of the water, it will actually cut out the sunlight for other plants, and it throws everything out of whack. The other organisms that were needing that or depending on some other source are now going to have to figure out something different. Energy production, we're talking about refineries, solar farms, things like that, and climate change. And some of these are permanent changes. So if you need a little longer to write those down, feel free to pause here and fill out your sheet. So how can we fix this? Well, of course, the thing that you've been learning since elementary school, we can reduce, reuse, and recycle. And it's hard to see how just one person can make a change, but honestly, anything is better than nothing, right? There's also some larger scale human activities like the development of housing and industry. They used to put them up, excuse the term, willy-nilly, but now they're actually using some careful planning and they minimize the environmental impact. The builders have to consider what waste is going to be generated and where it's going to lead out to, and how's it going to affect the environment. And if there's any protected animals in that area, they got to go around those. So there has been some new policies that have helped our ecosystems in that way. Some other things that humans have tried to do is they tried to put in artificial reefs. This was a great idea. They were human-made underwater structures that were sunk to promote marine life. However, the first few attempts weren't that great because when they saw sunken ships, like a ship that had been gunned down from a war, they saw that marine life were living in those ships. And, that just, they sunk, or sometimes it's an environmental cause like a storm that sinks a ship, but that fish were living in there. But when they started sinking them on purpose, they were using things like old ships. Or old pieces of equipment that had oil or gas on them. So they undid some good before they did some good back. We live and learn. The other thing is that they're starting to reduce over-harvesting. They've come up with regulations to not kill certain kinds of fish that got endangered. And sometimes they even make what's called these fish farms. They're smaller areas, and that lets, wild fish grow more freely and not get overfished. But this one needs work too, because there can be poor conditions for the organisms, like little tiny cages or too many in one area that makes for a buildup of toxins. So yeah, it still needs work, but does that mean that we don't try at all? Of course not. It's better than nothing, but we honestly need new ways, and it's going to come from you. It's going to come from the next generations. So if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, please go into it. They need people. All right, thanks for listening, and try to reduce, reuse, and recycle.